Welcome to the recorded webinar on training requirements in the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP. This training is designed to provide new and existing CACFP sponsors with detailed information on their responsibility to provide and receive training related to the CACFP and the supporting documentation that must be maintained to support these efforts. CACFP regulations outline training requirements for various stakeholders involved in the operation and administration of the program. These requirements apply to state agencies, such as RIDE, who are required to provide training and technical support on an ongoing basis for sponsors, including new sponsor training, annual sponsor training, and technical assistance visits as necessary. Independent child or adult care centers, who must provide training for all staff involved in the implementation of the program, both upon hire and at least annually thereafter, and sponsoring organizations, who have more than one facility under their CACFP agreement and are responsible for providing training for key facility staff prior to bringing a new facility on the program, during pre-operation visits of new facilities, and at least annually thereafter for all existing facilities. Sponsoring organizations also have self-monitoring responsibilities under the CACFP and must ensure that all monitoring staff have received training on at least an annual basis. As part of the CACFP application and renewal process, sponsors must demonstrate that they have the administrative capability to attend and provide required training as necessary. The development of a training plan is an important internal control that demonstrates a sponsor's accountability and commitment to maintaining program integrity. Any person outside of your organization should be able to read your CACFP training plan and understand the expectations surrounding who is required to receive training, how often training will be delivered, what training topics must be covered, who is responsible for delivering training, how training will be tracked and documented, and where documents related to training will be stored. Sponsors should also ask themselves how they will ensure that all staff have received training and what will happen if a staff member fails to attend required training. Developing clear expectations with staff will ensure that there are no surprises and will help you to fairly and consistently hold your staff accountable to your center's standards. Having a detailed training plan is also key to ensuring that your program continues to meet CACFP requirements, even in times of staff turnover. The first step to developing an effective CACFP training plan is to identify who is required to receive CACFP training and how often it will be conducted. CACFP regulations require that sponsors train key staff on CACFP duties and responsibilities. Key staff members would include staff with primary responsibility of CACFP operations, such as cooks, food service staff, or teachers responsible for the service and/or counting of meals, administrative staff responsible for CACFP record maintenance, such as finance staff, accountants, and center directors or owners, and any other staff who have responsibility for ensuring compliance with CACFP requirements, such as site monitors. Key staff members will vary by organization, so in developing your training plan, you will want to think through each step of the program, from planning meals to shopping, to preparing meals, to serving and counting meals, to compiling information on the claim for reimbursement, to identify all staff members with program responsibility in each step. Identifying responsible staff for each step of the process involved with the operation and administration of your CACFP will also help you to identify relevant training topics by position, which we will review shortly. Once you've identified who needs to be trained, the next step is to determine how often training will be delivered. At a minimum, sponsor administrative staff must plan to attend RIDE-provided CACFP training annually, and sponsors must deliver training to their key program staff annually. And all key staff must be trained prior to starting operations for any new site, and all new staff with program responsibilities must be trained upon hire. These are the minimum requirements. However, some sponsors may choose to deliver training at alternate intervals, such as at monthly staff meetings, on a quarterly basis, etc. Your training plan should be reflective of your actual practices and should be as specific as possible. For example, conducting training annually will meet the requirement, but specifically, when will annual training be conducted for each of the various groups of key staff? Does your center have annual PD days during a certain month on which CACFP training will be conducted, or do you hold monthly staff meetings and reserve a specific month to cover CACFP topics? Adding specific details to your training plan will help to ensure that training activities don't fall through the cracks. This should be a living, breathing document that your organization references to stay on track with meeting program requirements and is reflective of your actual practices. Now that you've identified who is going to receive training and when, you will need to determine what CACFP subjects should be covered for your various key staff members. Training will generally not be a one-size-fits-all solution, as each position within your organization will likely have different responsibilities in the program and will therefore not necessarily all need to have detailed information on the same topics. Civil rights training is the only CACFP topic that is required for all staff with responsibility in the program. Other training topics should be dependent on what each staff member's responsibilities are and should be reflective of your organization's actual practices and procedures. Tailoring training sessions to your specific audience members helps to prevent your staff from feeling like they are receiving an information overload, which may prevent them from fully absorbing important information related to their specific job tasks. The chart shown on the screen provides some examples of CACFP training content areas, training topics within each content area, and key staff for whom these topics might be relevant, depending on the makeup of your organization. This list is not meant to be all-inclusive, but may help sponsors in determining relevant training topics for their staff. Once you have identified the training topics required for each staff member, you may decide that the intervals at which you deliver your training will be dependent on the topic. For instance, you may only feel the need to train your teacher aides on general meal pattern requirements once, as they are not responsible for actually preparing the meals, but you may want to cover point-of-service meal counts more frequently, as this is a daily responsibility for your teachers and is vital to the accuracy of your claim for reimbursement. This should all be included in your training plan. Now that we know who will be trained, how often, and on what CACFP topics, sponsors must identify how this process will be managed. Who will be responsible for delivering each of the trainings that you've identified up to this point in your plan? The responsibility for training will likely fall to multiple people, either internal or external to your organization. For example, if your training plan includes that the executive director is responsible for attending RIDE's annual CACFP training, the person responsible for delivering training in this case is RIDE. However, you should identify who is responsible for ensuring that the director actually attends this training, since it is hosted by an external party. Your training plan may indicate that RIDE is the responsible training entity, but that the owner will ensure that the executive director is registered and attends training. Similarly, you may find certain training resources available on the internet, such as this recorded webinar, that will be used to conduct training. In that case, you would want to list a specific training website or resource that will be used and the person who will ensure that key staff view the training. When referring to staff members in your training plan, be sure to use titles rather than names to account for potential staff turnover. As with all CACFP requirements, documentation is key. If you don't document your efforts, it's like it never happened. At a minimum, sponsors must maintain dated training agendas with specific CACFP topics listed, as well as a dated sign-in sheet that includes the name, title, and signature of each employee in attendance. If your organization uses a specific template or form for training agendas or sign-in sheets, this should be indicated in your training plan. Some sponsors may choose to track training for employees via spreadsheet. This would also be documented as part of your overall training plan. Be sure to include information on how training will be documented for each of the training activities noted earlier in your plan. For instance, in addition to your annual training, how will you document training for new employees? Once you've determined how you will document training efforts, you should identify where training records will be stored. As with all CACFP documentation, training records must be maintained for a minimum of 3 years plus the current year and must be available for review by RIDE staff at all times. There's no specific requirement on how training documentation is maintained, but you may want to consider how accessible this information needs to be when determining a record-keeping system. For instance, it would be acceptable to maintain training documentation in each employee's individual file, but you would be required to pull all documentation from each file at the time of program review by RIDE. Records may be maintained differently for different types of trainings, so again, be sure that the plan details each training situation and the practices that are actually in place at your organization. For instance, you may maintain an annual training file in your CACFP file box, individual training records for newly hired employees and their employee files, and an electronic spreadsheet to track overall training records on the center's hard drive. Any or all of these methods is acceptable, but should be documented in your training plan. As you've learned throughout this presentation, having an effective training plan in place is incredibly important to ensure that all staff members have the knowledge and tools needed to maintain program integrity. But even the best laid plans can fail. It's not reasonable for a sponsor to assume that every staff member will be available for and attend every required training session as outlined in their plan. So a sponsor should include clear expectations for situations in which staff members miss required training sessions. It is up to each individual sponsor to develop a plan and consequences for staff members who fail to meet job performance expectations, but this should all be clearly communicated to staff at the time of hire. Setting clear expectations will help sponsors maintain high standards and ensure the equitable treatment of all employees. Your training plan may include language like all staff trainings will be scheduled with at least 2 weeks' notice and will be mandatory. In the event of an emergency that prevents a staff member from attending scheduled training, the staff member will be responsible for scheduling a makeup training session with the executive director within 2 weeks of the date of the originally scheduled training. Including this kind of language in the training plan and employee handbook leaves no ambiguity and sets standards for both the sponsor and the staff to ensure that everyone is clear on their individual role and responsibility. Internal controls, such as developing a CACFP training plan, are an important part of maintaining program integrity, but policies and procedures are only as important as we make them. As a best practice, it is recommended that sponsors use the RIDE-provided CACFP training policy and procedures template to help them plan for success in meeting CACFP training requirements. As I've mentioned throughout this training, a training plan should be specific to your organization and should be updated often to reflect your actual practices. Throughout this presentation, we have covered the minimum requirements as they relate to training, but sponsors are encouraged to maximize training efforts by providing training for all responsible individuals, such as board chairs, even if they did not have specific responsibility in the day-to-day operation or administration of the program. Reinforce training regularly through spot checks, one-on-one conversations, and other informal settings. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of CACFP training resources available. Just be sure to make it meaningful. Don't waste your time or your staff's time by covering topics that are not relevant to them or that do not reflect the actual practices in your organization. Lastly, solicit feedback. It's important to check back in with staff to see if they've received your intended message or some points that may not have landed with them. Are there topics that your staff wish they had more training on? Do your staff members feel comfortable with their CACFP responsibilities? You won't know unless you ask. This concludes today's training on CACFP training requirements. To access any templates or forms referenced during this presentation, please visit the RIDE Child Nutrition Program's website at the link found on the screen. If you have any questions related to this training or other CACFP topics, please contact your RIDE program specialist or email our General Child Nutrition inbox at the email address found on the screen. Thank you.